So, in the year 2024, United States household debt actually crossed $17.5 trillion, which is, yeah, it's a number so huge that the human brain almost just shuts down when you hear it.
Right, it just becomes an abstraction.
Yeah, totally abstract. But that abstraction translates to a really crushing reality on the ground for people. I mean, it means marriages falling apart under the weight of unpaid mortgages. It means parents staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, just paralyzed by anxiety over credit card minimums.
No, for sure. Debt of that magnitude drives human beings to absolute despair.
It does. But what if you were told that you hold a personal liability, like a spiritual ledger of offenses against a holy God that makes $17.5 trillion look like spare change you found in the couch cushions? Welcome to reform thinking. You know, when you look closely at human nature, you find a really startling contradiction right at the center of how we relate to one another.
Yeah, that tension is always there.
Right. Human beings are just absolutely desperate to receive grace when we fail. But at the same time, we are fiercely, almost violently resistant to extending that same grace when someone fails us.
We really are.
We want God and our neighbors to overlook our massive repeated faults. But we keep meticulous, detailed receipts of every single slight committed against us. So today, we are opening up a source text that attacks this contradiction head on. We are doing a deep dive into an analysis of Jesus' parable of the unforgiving servant from Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35.
And that staggering spiritual insolvency you just mentioned, that is the central reality we have to confront today. Our mission for this deep dive is to examine the theological weight of this specific parable through a strictly reformed lens.
Which is such a vital framework for this text.
It really is. We are going to observe how Christ's words totally demolish human self-righteousness. We'll see how they highlight the necessity of sovereign grace and how they demand a radically changed heart from anyone who claims to belong to the King.
Yeah, so this is not just a moralistic fable about being a nicer person.
No, not at all. We are looking at the terrifying, awe-inspiring arithmetic of divine justice and divine mercy. And to grasp the weight of this parable, we first have to look at the question that prompted Jesus to tell the story in the first place.
Right, we have to get into the context.
Yes, we have to move from our modern anxiety about student loans and interest rates back to the ancient context of the covenant community in the first century. Jesus does not just drop this parable out of a clear blue sky. The context is critical. This passage does not exist in a vacuum.
It's right in the middle of a very specific discourse.
Right. It immediately follows Jesus' explicit instructions on church discipline, which you find right there in Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20. Christ is outlining the life of the ecclesia, the gathered church.
Yeah, the local body of believers.
He has just told his disciples that if a brother sins against you, you are to go and tell him his fault privately. And if he refuses to listen, you take one or two others along with you.
And it escalates from there.
Right. If he still refuses, you tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen, even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So, Jesus requires his church to pursue holiness and to confront sin head-on.
And that sets up a massive tension right from the start. Because when you talk about confronting sin, taking witnesses, and bringing matters before the church, it sounds like a legal courtroom.
It sounds very rigid.
Yeah, very rigid. But then he transitions straight into forgiveness. This means the forgiveness he is about to discuss is not some sentimental permissiveness.
No, it is not turning a blind eye to abuse.
Right, or smiling and pretending evil does not hurt. It is a gritty, realistic necessity for sinners living together under Christ's rule. You have a community that must uphold absolute moral truth while simultaneously overflowing with mercy.
Which is a very hard balance to strike.
It is. And right on the heels of that heavy instruction about confronting sin, Peter speaks up. Peter asks, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times.
And Peter probably thought he was being so generous there.
Oh, he definitely did. Now, if you study the rabbinic tradition of the first century, you see why Peter frames the question this way. The prevailing thought among the religious leaders of the day was that you only needed to forgive someone 3 times.
Only 3 times.
Yeah, 3 strikes and you're out. On the 4th offense, the obligation for mercy expired, and you were legally and morally cleared to retaliate or cut the person off. So Peter takes that cultural standard, doubles it, adds one for good measure, and offers up 7 times.
He genuinely believes he is being incredibly magnanimous here.
He really does. He expects Jesus to validate his extraordinary patience.
But Jesus flips Peter's entire worldview upside down. Jesus responds by commanding forgiveness 77 times, or in some Greek manuscripts and translations, 70 times 7.
Which is just a massive number.
It is. But the specific number Christ chooses is not random. It points to a fascinating historical and biblical connection. The source material points out that this is a direct, calculated allusion to Genesis chapter 4, verse 24.
Oh, going all the way back to Genesis.
Yes, effectively reversing the depravity of Lamech. If you go back to the early chapters of Genesis, Lamech was a descendant of Cain. Cain, of course, was the first murderer, and God placed a mark on Cain, declaring that anyone who killed him would face a sevenfold vengeance.
Right, God's protection over Cain.
Generations later, Lamech takes that standard of divine protection and twists it into a boast of human malice. Lamech gathers his wives and sings a song about his own capacity for violence. He claims that he kills a man just for striking him, and a young man simply for wounding him.
He's basically bragging about his brutality.
He is. Then Lamech boasts, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. He brags about exponential, disproportionate retribution. He takes pride in being completely unmerciful.
So Jesus is pulling directly from that specific story.
Yes, where Lamech boasted of a 77-fold vengeance, Christ steps into history and demands a 77-fold grace. He takes the ancient metric for human depravity and blood feuds and flips it into the absolute standard for kingdom mercy.
I love that historical connection because it exposes what is really going on in Peter's head. Think about Peter's mindset here. He operates like a frequent flyer program for resentment.
That's a great way to put it.
He wants to earn enough grievance miles so he can eventually cash them in for a guilt-free revenge trip. He wants to know the actual boundary where his patience can legally stop and where his retaliation can officially begin.
He wants a quota.
Yeah, a quota. He wants to be able to put a little check mark in his mental notebook every time his brother wrongs him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on that 7th time, he wants the satisfaction of closing the book, slamming it on the table, and saying, I am now justified in my bitterness. You have exhausted your grace account.
And we do the very same thing today.
We really do. We do the exact same thing in our modern relationships. We keep mental filing cabinets of every time a spouse overlooked us, a coworker took credit for our project, or a friend spoke sharply to us.
Waiting for that limit to hit.
Right. We wait for the moment we reach our internal quota, so we can unleash our resentment with a clean conscience. We want a mathematical formula that permits us to withhold love.
And that is the theology Jesus completely dismantles right here. Jesus abolishes the entire principle of calculation. The kingdom of heaven does not operate by the mathematics of pride.
Wow, the mathematics of pride.
Scorekeeping is the instinct of the fallen human heart. Fallen humanity seeks to justify bitterness under the guise of righteousness. Peter thought his total of 7 was large enough to impress God, but Jesus shows that the act of counting itself is the problem.
Because if you're counting, you aren't really forgiving.
Spot on. You cannot operate as a private auditor of other people's failures when you yourself survive only by undeserved pardon. The ledger has to be laid down entirely because grace has entered the account. The moment you are counting the offenses, you've already stopped forgiving.
So forgiveness is basically a state of being, not a transaction.
Yes. Forgiveness in the kingdom of Christ is qualitative, not quantitative. It is a disposition of the heart, not a tally on a chalkboard.
So since Jesus rejects Peter's petty arithmetic, he tells a story that blows up the scale entirely. He shifts the focus away from these horizontal day-to-day irritations between people and forces Peter to look at our vertical insolvency before God.
That vertical relationship is everything here.
It is. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. And one servant is brought in who owes 10,000 talents. Let's break down the math here, because the Greek text reveals an amount that is intentionally absurd.
It is completely off the charts.
The phrase is mirin talenton. A single talent in the Greco-Roman world was equivalent to roughly 20 years of a day laborer's wages.
20 years.
Yeah, 20 years of back-breaking, sun-up to sundown physical labor for one single unit of this currency. And this man owes 10,000 of them. The word myria is the highest numerical term available in the ancient Greek language.
It was as high as they could count.
Right. It was often used to represent an incalculable multitude. It's akin to saying a zillion today, but with actual mathematical weight behind it. So you take 20 years of wages and you multiply it by 10,000. You arrive at 200,000 years of labor.
Which is just an impossible figure.
We are talking about billions, perhaps trillions of dollars in modern equivalents. It is a sum that is physically impossible to settle. Even if this man lived 1,000 lifetimes, and gave every single penny back to the king without ever buying food or shelter, he couldn't do it.
The hyperbole is intentional, and it is devastating. Christ paints a picture of total hopelessness. This servant is not struggling under a heavy burden that he might eventually relieve through disciplined budgeting.
He's not just behind on his car payment.
No, he is crushed beneath an obligation that renders him morally and practically bankrupt. But look at the illusion of moralism the servant displays in response. When the king orders him to be sold, along with his wife and children, to recoup a tiny fraction of the loss, the servant falls on his knees.
He gets desperate.
He does. He pleads, "Have patience with me and I will pay you everything."
Wait, hold on. I'm putting myself in this servant's shoes for a second. He is not running away. He is not denying the debt exists. He is asking for a payment plan.
That is how it sounds at first.
Yeah, to a modern listener, that actually sounds incredibly responsible. He is looking the king in the eye and promising to make it right. Why does the text view this specific promise so negatively? Why is his attempt to pay back the debt considered a bad thing?
Because it reveals a terrifying blindness to his own condition. His promise to pay it back is an utter impossibility. The author of our study calls the servant's promise a masterpiece of self-delusion.
A masterpiece of self-delusion. That's a strong phrase.
It is, because this man honestly thinks he just needs a better installment plan. He thinks he needs an extension on the deadline. He completely fails to realize he is utterly bankrupt. This points directly to the Reformed doctrine of total depravity, as articulated in the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 6.
Oh, let's break that down for a minute.
So, total depravity does not mean a person is as evil as they could possibly be in their outward actions. It means that the corruption of sin has extended to every part of their nature, their mind, their will, and their affections.
So the whole system is infected.
Exactly. Yes, completely infected. In his fallen state, man is completely unable to contribute a single cent toward his own redemption. He lacks the spiritual capital to pay off his moral debt.
But he still thinks he can.
Right. The servant thinks that with enough time, enough effort, perhaps enough religious zeal, he can satisfy the king's righteous demands. The text thoroughly refutes the Roman Catholic notion of a treasury of merit, or any moralism that suggests fallen humans can somehow compensate God for their sin through good works, penance, or charity.
So trying to pay God back is actually an insult to the scale of the debt.
Yes. The debt of sin is not difficult just because the number of our sins is large. It is impossible to pay because the one offended is infinitely holy. Every sin is a crime of cosmic treason against the creator of the universe.
Cosmic treason.
You cannot pay off a debt of infinite offense with the finite stained currency of human works.
And the consequences of this infinite debt are catastrophic. The king initially commands that the man, his wife, his children, and all that he has be sold into slavery. The ancient world had very strict, brutal laws regarding debt.
It wasn't like modern bankruptcy.
No, you did not just declare bankruptcy and start over with a lower credit score. Your entire household was liquidated. Your family was sold into forced labor.
Yes, this illustrates the judicial reality of sin. Sin carries generational and communal consequences. Guilt before a holy God is not a private, isolated matter. It infects everything connected to the sinner.
It's contagious, almost.
It is. And this judicial reality shatters the modern prosperity gospel, which treats God as a cosmic vending machine or a debtor to man. The prosperity gospel suggests that if we just speak the right words, claim the right promises, or possess enough faith, God owes us a blessing.
Like God is obligated to us.
Right. It reduces the Almighty to a business partner who is contractually obligated to make us wealthy and healthy. But this parable shows we bring absolutely nothing to our salvation, except the sin that makes it necessary. We are totally destitute.
We have zero leverage.
Zero. The servant's plea for more time is the instinctive religion of fallen humanity. Give me time, and I will earn my way out. Let me try harder. Let me be a better person. But the sinner does not need installment payments. The sinner needs full, absolute cancellation of the debt. The sinner needs a substitute.
With the servant facing total ruin and offering an empty, delusional promise to pay back trillions of dollars on a laborer's wage, the narrative hinges entirely on the unexpected reaction of the king. The servant begs for time, but the king gives him something entirely different.
Something he could never have anticipated.
Yeah. The text uses a very specific Greek term here, splanchnisomai. The king is moved with pity. This word does not mean he just felt a little bit bad for the guy. It refers to a gut-level yearning in the inward parts.
It's a very physical description.
It is. The ancients believed the bowels, the guts, were the seat of human emotion. So this is a visceral, physical compassion. In the New Testament, this specific word is used almost exclusively to describe divine compassion.
It's a uniquely divine response.
Yeah, it is the same word used to describe the way Jesus felt when he saw the harassed and helpless crowds, or when he saw the widow of Nain weeping behind the coffin of her only son. It is a divine, agonizing love that compels action.
And that compassion originates entirely within the king. The servant's false promise did not merit this pity. The servant did not negotiate well enough to earn it. The king's action is completely sovereign.
This is completely one-sided.
Right. If we look at this through the framework of the Westminster Confession, specifically Chapter 11 on justification, this moment is a brilliant illustration of a unilateral monergistic act.
Let's define that term for anyone listening who might not be familiar.
Good idea. Monergism means the work is done by one party alone, as opposed to synergism, which is a cooperative effort. In justification, God acts monergistically. He justifies the ungodly, based entirely on his free grace.
So the servant didn't cooperate to get the forgiveness?
No, not at all. It is not based on the sinner's ability to pay.
Yeah.
It's not based on God looking down the corridors of time and foreseeing that the sinner will eventually become a good, manageable person. The action, the decision, and the staggering cost belong solely to the king.
The king absorbs it all.
The initiative lies entirely with the throne, not with the debtor. The king absorbs the financial loss because his character is defined by this gut-level mercy.
But that raises a massive theological problem, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, you cannot just make trillions of dollars disappear into thin air. If a bank forgives your mortgage today, the bank absorbs that financial loss. The debt does not vanish into the ether. Someone always pays for it. If the king cancels 10,000 talents, the king is personally taking a 10,000 talent hit to his own treasury.
That is the crucial theological point. Scripture interpreting Scripture, which is a primary interpretive principle in the Westminster Confession, Chapter 1, Paragraph 9, shows that God cannot simply ignore his own justice.
He can't just sweep it under the rug.
He cannot.
Yeah.
He cannot just wave a magic wand over the universe and pretend cosmic treason never happened. A just judge must punish crimes. If a human judge let a serial killer walk free just because he felt bad for him, we would call that judge corrupt.
We would want that judge removed from the bench.
Of course. God is not a corrupt judge. Therefore, this astonishing compassion points directly to the cross. Christ does not just wave away the debt. He pays it in his own blood. This is the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement.
So the debt was actually paid, just not by the servant.
Yes. The king absorbs the massive loss, but the gospel reveals the mechanism of how God can do this while remaining perfectly just. Christ steps in as the substitute. He lives the perfect life the servant failed to live. And on the cross, he bears the infinite wrath of God against the sins of his people.
He takes a hit.
He satisfies the inflexible claims of divine justice. What the servant could not repay in 200,000 years of labor, Christ answers completely by his obedient life and his atoning death. The debt is not ignored. It is transferred to the shoulders of the Son of God.
So if the debt is truly that massive and the king's forgiveness is truly that absolute, you would expect this servant to walk out of the palace a completely changed man.
You would think so.
You would expect him to be weeping with joy in the streets, hugging strangers, buying everyone dinner, overflowing with this gut-level compassion he just received. He was facing the loss of his wife, his children, his freedom, and his entire future. In one breath, he was given his life back.
A total reset.
Yeah, a total reset. But the story takes a jarring, violent turn. It reveals the true, wretched state of his unregenerate heart. The forgiven servant walks out of the throne room, finds a peer, a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii. Let's look at the math again. A denarius was roughly 1 day's wage for a laborer.
A single day's wage.
Right, so 100 denarii is 100 days' wages. It is about a third of a year's salary.
It is a mathematically insignificant fraction compared to what he owed the king.
I hear what you're saying about the math, but practically speaking, it is incredibly difficult to tell someone who has been defrauded or abused that their perpetrator's debt to them is insignificant compared to their debt to God.
That is a very valid point.
100 days' wages is still a substantial amount of money. If someone stole 4 months of your salary today, you would be severely impacted. You might miss rent, you might lose your car, you would feel a massive sense of betrayal. The text isn't minimizing the genuine pain of earthly offenses, is it? How do we navigate that without minimizing the real pain people experience?
That is a very serious pastoral observation. The Bible never minimizes human suffering, and it never commands us to pretend that betrayal, theft, abuse, or slander do not hurt. They cause genuine, sometimes lifelong damage. The 100 denarii represents real loss.
Okay, so the pain is validated.
It is. However, the force of the parable lies entirely in the proportion. The first servant was forgiven an absolute ocean of liability. He was facing an eternity of ruin for a debt of billions, yet he is prepared to utterly destroy a fellow human being over a single drop.
An ocean versus a drop.
Yes. The math is what makes the hypocrisy so glaring. Whatever our fellow humans may owe us, no matter how deeply they have wounded us, it cannot compare to the infinite magnitude of what we owe a perfectly holy God.
That's a really hard truth to swallow.
It is very hard. When we fail to see the proportion, we elevate our own pain above God's holiness. We act as if our localized suffering is the center of the moral universe, while ignoring the cosmic rebellion we have perpetrated against the Creator.
And his reaction to this debt of 100 denarii is shockingly violent. The text says the servant seizes his peer by the throat and begins choking him. The Greek verb used here is epnogen.
It's a very aggressive word.
It is. What is terrifying about this specific word is that it is in the imperfect tense. Grammatically, that indicates a continuous, ongoing, relentless action. He is not just grabbing his shirt collar for a moment of intimidation. He has his hands wrapped around his fellow servant's neck, actively suffocating him, repeatedly demanding, "Pay what you owe."
He is literally squeezing the life out of him.
He is squeezing the life out of a man over 4 months' pay. He then throws the man in a debtor's prison, ensuring his family will suffer until the debt is magically produced.
The psychological terror in this scene is brilliant. The chilling repetition designed by Christ in the narrative cannot be missed. When the second servant is attacked, he falls down and makes a desperate plea.
What does he say?
He says, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." It is the exact same phrase, word for word, that the first servant used in front of the king just moments before.
Wow, word for word.
Yes. The first servant hears his own former cry echoing back at him from the lips of his peer. He sees the same posture of desperation, but he feels absolutely nothing. It is a stunning display of spiritual amnesia.
Spiritual amnesia.
This is what pride does to the human mind. Pride selectively edits our memory. It magnifies the sins of others while entirely erasing our own. He remembers the 100 denarii owed to him with perfect crystalline clarity, but he has completely forgotten the 10,000 talents he was just forgiven.
So his memory works just fine when he is the victim.
Precisely. His memory is highly functional when it comes to his rights, but completely broken when it comes to his pardon.
You know, the author of our text draws a really provocative parallel here. They look at modern secular movements. And just to be clear, we are just impartially reporting what the author observed in the source material here.
Right, we're just looking at the source's analysis.
Right. So the author specifically looks at cancel culture and critical race theory. And they observe that these frameworks operate on a very similar system of perpetual, unpayable debt. According to the analysis, these modern systems demand absolute systemic payment and endless personal vengeance.
So there's no mechanism for actual forgiveness.
According to the source, no. They create a society where offenses can never truly be wiped clean, where apologies are never sufficient, and where individuals are forever defined by their worst mistakes or their ancestral guilt. The author argues they mirror the unforgiving servant's refusal to extend grace, choosing instead to nurse grievances and demand retribution rather than seeking actual redemption.
When you look at those contemporary frameworks objectively, the comparison illustrates the stark contrast between the world's standard of justice and the kingdom's standard of grace.
They are totally opposed to each other.
They are. The worldly standard is fundamentally about demanding strict, exacting payment for every slight. It says, "You owe me, and I will not rest until you are ruined." It uses shame and exclusion as weapons to enforce compliance.
But the kingdom operates differently.
The kingdom's standard is entirely different. It is about mimicking divine mercy. It recognizes that our only true right before God was the debtor's prison, yet we were released at the cost of the king's own son.
So to demand that from others is just hypocritical.
Yes, a heart that demands strict payment from others, a heart that participates in the endless cycle of cultural cancellation while relying on free grace from God, is living in a state of grotesque theological hypocrisy. It is demanding the law for everyone else while demanding grace for yourself.
And that hypocrisy does not go unnoticed. The narrative connects this private violence back to the public community, just as Jesus taught earlier in Matthew 18 about the church being a covenant community that handles disputes together. The king's household watches this unfold.
They see the whole thing.
They do. The fellow servants see the choking, they see the man dragged away to prison, and the text says they are deeply grieved. They go and report this cruelty to the king. This is a heavy reminder that sin is never truly private.
It always has collateral damage.
Always. A merciless, bitter spirit poisons the whole fellowship of the church. When you refuse to forgive someone, you do not just isolate yourself from that one person, you introduce a toxin into the entire body of believers.
And the king's response to this report is terrifying. He summons the man back to the throne room and looks at him. Notice the title he gives him. He does not call him confused.
He doesn't say he made a mistake.
He does not say he is emotionally strained from the trauma of his previous debt. He does not suggest he just needs more time to heal or some therapy to process his feelings. He calls him a wicked servant.
Wicked!
Yes. The moral logic the king uses is inescapable. Should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? To receive divine pity, to be spared from total annihilation, and then actively refuse to show pity to a neighbor is the definition of moral evil.
It's just flat out evil.
It is a fundamental rejection of the logic of grace. It proves that the servant loved the benefit of forgiveness, but he absolutely hated the principle of forgiveness.
The king's sentence is immediate and severe. The man is delivered to the tormentors until he pays his unpayable debt. Now let's connect the dots here. We already established mathematically that 10,000 talents is impossible to pay. It would take hundreds of thousands of years of labor.
You can never pay it off.
Right. So, delivering him to the jailers until the debt is paid means this punishment has absolutely no end. He can never satisfy the requirement. The source identifies this consequence clearly as a picture of eternal conscious torment. It is a picture of hell.
Which introduces a massive theological tension, and we must clarify the Reformed theology here to prevent a severe misunderstanding of the gospel.
Yeah, we need to be really clear here.
The question is this: does this parable teach that a truly justified believer can lose their salvation? If you are a Christian and you stumble into sin by holding a grudge against a family member, does God revoke your justification, reinstate your 10,000 talent debt, and send you to hell?
That is a terrifying thought.
It is, but the Reformed tradition firmly says no. And it cites the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 7, on the perseverance of the saints. The doctrine states that those whom God has accepted in his beloved, effectually called and sanctified by his Spirit, can neither totally nor finally fall away from the state of grace.
So they are secure.
Their salvation is secured by the unchangeable love of God the Father and the efficacious merit and intercession of Jesus Christ.
Wait, if the doctrine of perseverance says true believers cannot lose their salvation, how do we reconcile the text? The man is explicitly told his massive debt is forgiven in verse 32, and then in verse 34 he is cast to the tormentors. To a plain reading, it looks like he had salvation, and then he lost it because he failed a moral test.
The key is understanding the nature of parables and the nature of visible versus invisible realities in the church. The unforgiving heart is not a loss of grace, but proof of its absolute absence from the very beginning.
So he was never truly forgiven in a spiritual sense?
Right. The servant experienced an outward temporal suspension of consequence in the parable, which represents the external privileges of being part of the visible church. He tasted the patience of the king. But his violent, unforgiving, throat-grabbing nature proved his heart was never actually transformed. He was never regenerated.
He looked the part, but he wasn't changed.
As the Apostle John writes in 1 John 2:18, they went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. If a person remains habitually bitter, merciless, and cruel as a pattern of life, it proves they have never been born again by the Holy Spirit.
Because a good tree bears good fruit.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, yes, a heart completely untouched by grace cannot produce grace. The wicked servant represents the false professor, someone who sits in the pew, sings the hymns, uses the theological language of being forgiven, but shows by their relentless, unyielding resentment toward others that they are total strangers to the king. They have the vocabulary of grace, but none of the reality.
Which brings up the Westminster Confession, chapter 19, discussing the law of God. If we cannot lose our salvation, how should the justified, secure believer understand this severe, terrifying warning about the tormentors? Why does Jesus speak so harshly to people who are supposedly safe in his grace?
The warning functions as what theologians call the third use of the law. It acts as a rule of life. It calls true believers to serious, agonizing self-examination.
We have to test ourselves.
Yes, we must examine the reality of our union with Christ. True, saving faith inevitably produces the fruit of a forgiving spirit. Not perfectly, of course. True believers will often struggle with bitterness. They will shed tears fighting against a desire to retaliate.
It's still a fight.
But the overall trajectory of a justified life is toward mercy. The warning in this parable wakes us up from spiritual lethargy. It acts like a splash of ice water to the face, forcing us to ask, is my life demonstrating the mercy I claim to rely on for my eternal survival?
That's a sobering question.
If I am comfortable living in perpetual bitterness, I have every reason to question whether I actually know Christ at all.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? The theology is heavy, but it cannot stay in the abstract. This deep dive has to move from the first century Roman courts into your living room, your workplace, and your church.
We have to bring it home.
Yeah. The text breaks this practical application down into 3 specific areas: head, heart, and hands. Let's start with the head. But understanding the math in your head isn't enough, is it? Because when someone actually wrongs you, the anger doesn't live in your intellect. It lives in your gut.
The head represents the intellectual baseline. You must actually believe the staggering reality of your own spiritual insolvency. You cannot view your sin as a series of minor slip-ups, unfortunate mistakes, or psychological trauma responses.
You have to own it.
You have to look at the law of God and admit, I owe 10,000 talents. I have committed cosmic treason. You have to grasp the doctrine of justification intellectually, the reality that your billions in debt were canceled solely by sovereign compassion, not your own effort.
If you think you earned it, you'll never forgive anyone else.
Right. If you think you are basically a good person who just needs a little bit of God's coaching to reach your potential, you will never be able to forgive others. Why? Because you don't think you've been forgiven of much. You think God gave you a slight discount.
Wow, a slight discount.
Only people who know they were saved from the gallows can look at an offender and offer pardon.
Then we move to the heart, which targets your affections. This is where it gets incredibly uncomfortable. The text demands a gut-level gratitude for the king's mercy, which must naturally produce a holy revulsion at our own self-righteousness.
It targets our deepest feelings.
It does. It means actively identifying and crushing the idols of victimhood. In our modern psychological landscape, it is remarkably easy to build a core identity around how we have been wronged. We take our past injuries and we wear them like armor.
It's very common today.
We use the very real trauma we have experienced as a shield to justify our current cruelty, our sharp tongue, or our refusal to love. We say, you don't understand what they did to me, so I have the right to be bitter.
But the text won't allow that.
Yeah. No. The heart application means realizing that the ground is completely level at the foot of the cross. Your trauma is real, but it does not grant you an exemption from the command to love.
And finally, the hands. This is the outward obedience, and frankly, this is where the theology hits the pavement. It is the hardest part of the Christian life.
It's the actual action.
It means going to the spouse who betrayed your trust, the parent who neglected you, the sibling who lied about you, or the church elder who handled a situation terribly, and offering genuine, heart-level pardon.
You actually have to do it.
You do. It means laying down the weapon you have been holding against their throat. You actively stop demanding that they pay you back for the emotional or relational debt they owe you. You cancel the 100 denarii.
But practically speaking, how does a person actually do that? When the betrayal is deep, when the wounds are fresh, when the person who hurt you isn't even, human willpower is not enough to just let it go.
It definitely isn't.
You can't just grit your teeth and force your heart to feel mercy towards someone who destroyed your life. What is the actual mechanism for forgiveness here?
You cannot do this by following psychological checklists or muscling through with sheer willpower. You cannot look within yourself to find the strength, because within yourself is only the flesh, which desires vengeance.
So we have to look outside ourselves.
Yes, you can only drop the weapons of bitterness because you are clothed in Christ. The Holy Spirit is the agent who enables you to release the throat of your debtor. And the text beautifully connects this ongoing need for reorientation to the Lord's Supper.
The communion table.
The sacraments are given to us to strengthen our weak faith. When the church gathers at the communion table, it is a physical, visible sign that your infinite debt was nailed to the cross. You take the bread and the cup into your hands.
You can physically touch it.
You taste the bitterness of the wine, representing the blood that paid your 10,000 talents. You do not come to the table because you have achieved perfect moral victory over your grudges. You come because you are a bankrupt debtor who has been shown immeasurable pity.
We come desperate.
As you physically participate in the Lord's Supper, the Holy Spirit reorients your brain's perspective on justice and mercy. Empowered by that union with Christ, sustained by the ordinary means of grace, you find the supernatural strength to extend that pity horizontally to the people around you. You forgive because you are continually feeding on the forgiveness of Christ.
We have covered a massive amount of theological and practical ground today. We have looked at the sheer crushing weight of 10,000 talents, 200,000 years of unpayable debt.
A debt we could never touch.
Right. We have seen the liberating unilateral truth of Christ's payment on the cross. And we have seen the terrifying, blinding hypocrisy of choking our neighbors for pennies when we have been forgiven billions.
It puts everything in perspective.
It really does. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week, as you sit in traffic, or as you interact with that family member who always gets under your skin.
Something to really sit with.
Yeah. When you look closely at the grievances you hold on to, the grudges you nurse in quiet moments, the resentments you refuse to let go of, ask yourself a very hard question. Are those grievances really protecting your righteous sense of justice? Or are they quietly proving that you still do not comprehend what it cost the king to forgive you?
That is the ultimate test.
If our earthly resentments are a mirror, what do they reflect about our understanding of the cross? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.